Coates. I work for Inter Games. I'm going to be somewhat hosting this panel, but more than anything, I'm going to be handing it over to my very esteemed colleagues who are far more interesting and far more learned than me. And I'm just going to go through and let them introduce themselves now. So first of all, Ellis, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Ellis Devereux. I go by they, them. I'm non-binary or agender and bisexual. And I work at Endreams as a third-party publishing executive, where I basically get to review indie dev pitches for VR games. And I'm also a narrative designer and writer and associated creative things.
Fantastic. A list as long as your arm. It's wonderful
I
to
know.
hear. We have Susi.
Hi everyone, I'm Susi Bauer. I work at Into Games as the head of careers. So I look after all kinds of things like apprenticeships and vocational pathways. And before that, I worked in the games industry for 7.5 years, mostly in translation and testing on games like RuneScape. And my pronouns are she and they. And since it's an LGBT panel, I'm also happy to share that I'm bi. So there we go. Next person.
Awesome. Cheers, Susi. We have the fantastic Adele with us.
Hello. I'm Adele. I am the content writer at Into Games. I go by she, her pronouns, and I identify as pansexual. And I've been in the industry for about 6 to 7 months.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Thanks, Adele. We have Alice.
Hello, yes, I'm Alice Bowman, and my pronouns are she, they. I work at Traumix Games as a narrative designer, and yeah, I'm pansexual, and I can't remember what else I was going to say. Oh, I'm also the chair of our brand new employee resource group at Traumix. So it's like a LGBTQ+ group, and we're called Queer Mix. So happy to talk about this as well during the panel.
Lovely. Brilliant name as well. And finally, last but not least, we have Duncan.
Hi all. I'm Duncan. I'm the HR advisor at Outplay Entertainment. I've been there for a few months. I use the pronouns he, him, and I identify as a gay man. And similar to Alice, I lead up our diversity group that's called InPlay.
Thanks so much. And since everyone else said it, I use he, him pronouns, and I identify as a bisexual. Cool. So lovely to have everyone. Lovely to see that we've got some folks in the audience as well. We will be taking sort of questions and bits like that from the chat. There are some pre-arranged questions and topics that I just want to go over first, but do make sure you're engaging in the live panel chat, and I'd love to see people's thoughts as we speak. So first of all, I thought, seeing as this is the panel that it is, I thought we could go over people's journeys into the industry, and whether or not there were elements of their identity that played any role, any negative role, or maybe it's a wholly positive experience. But what role that sort of played in people's journeys into the roles that they're in now. Alice, maybe we could start with you.
Sure, yeah. So I first started getting into game development 11 years ago was when I decided to study it. And back then I was a lot younger and I hadn't really sort of considered games being a thing that anyone made, let alone me. And it was when I started playing BioWare's games that I kind of realized that games were made for people like me, that there were, options in the game that catered towards people who aren't cis men, and also that there were romance options that catered towards like queer players as well. And it was my fandom for the BioWare games that got me into the idea of making games myself. So that was like a really pivotal moment for me, where some representation has sort of affected my entire life since then. So that's been like really important for me. Yeah, I guess that's kind of how it's helped shape my journey. And since then, I think I've mostly been lucky enough to be in circles and communities that have been largely very supportive of, having me in the games industry. But there's always moments of resistance as well. And for me, I find it really important to be part of diversity and inclusion initiatives and things like that. So I think that's been a motivating factor throughout my career. And I've also been really motivated to make games that include queer content as well, because that's something that is expressive of who I am, someone who loves romance and someone who is queer, particularly the romance genre and dating sim genre. So yeah, it's definitely something that always feeds into the work I do.
Brilliant. And I suppose that having affected you, seeing those games, those BioWare games specifically, that's something that you feel you can maybe bring to the next generation of games makers, would you say?
Yeah, I really hope so. I hope that, having more content out there that is representative of people will help them realize that, they are thought of in the games industry and cared about, and that we want to represent their stories. And then also things like being involved into games and being involved in Limit Break and various other bits and pieces like that, where it's something that has diversity as part of the mission. That's also useful for just kind of getting involved in making sure that there's support for people who are underrepresented and want to get into the industry. So I think that that's also an important part of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. Let's get other folks' just stories on how they got into the industry. Susie, I'll come to you next. What was your sort of journey? And I guess Alice has touched on something really cool there, which is maybe the first experience of understanding that that type of identity can be integrated into games, or definitely very representative in games. Do you have any similar stories on your journey into the industry?
Well, I think the first thing that both my games career and my bisexuality have in common is that I realized both things quite late. I realized quite late I can work into games, and I want to work in games. And at the same time, I also realized quite late that this is part of my identity. So I kind of stumbled into the industry more or less. I just knew I really wanted to work into games, and I applied to all sorts of roles, mostly in the game design area, but I ended up in translation and testing first because I'm a bilingual speaker. So I found this German translation job, and I was like, cool, I'll do that instead and see where it leads me. And then I kind of did that for quite some time. And in the beginning, my identity didn't have much of an impact, but over time, as AI grew within the company, because we also started a diversity and inclusion group within LGBT network, and that's when we started having really good discussions where I could bring my own perspective into discussions about, how can we make sure that our games are inclusive. If we spot things that maybe aren't ideal wording, we had a platform to discuss how we can make things better or even bring suggestions. And I also noticed in my own translations that I came across, because I was quite active in the LGBTQ discussions on Twitter and so on. I also started thinking about if I do translations, how can I make sure that this is also inclusive in my language, which is often a really big big difficulty, because English and German have very different ways of talking about gender and identity. So it was really interesting, and I actually did a lot of extra researching, which I think I might have not done if I hadn't had that network and that constant discussion about topics like this.
I am fighting the urge to completely fixate on what the differences are between the German and English, because that sounds absolutely awesome, and we must talk about that later.
Yes.
But for now, Susie's spoken about Duncan. I'm going to come to you next, but Susie's spoken about and Alice mentioned it as well, about obviously those sort of diversity groups within. I know that's something that you're involved with as well. So if you could just speak onto your journey into the industry, but also maybe your journey into that area around HR, around sort of diversity and inclusion as well.
Yeah, so I obviously I come from the business side of the organisation rather than the game development side. I am a passionate nerd who's always wanted to be in the games industry, but really have no particular talent on the game design side, on coding or anything like that. So I worked in retail, video games retail for a while. I decided, I want to get into the games industry, and I have a passion for supporting and working with people. So I went out and I did my HR degree, and it's been sort of since then, it's been trying to find my road back and trying to find an HR job in gaming. And then when I was speaking with Outplay, I said, inclusion, diversity is one of my passions. It's something I want to work on and be part of, which just fitted really with what their vision is going forwards. And so I've taken over their in-play group, and it's a really genuinely enthusiastic group of people that want to push forwards and drive forwards inclusivity and diversity in the organisation. We meet sort of once a month, and obviously the big thing we're doing at the moment is Pride. So we've got a few little bits and pieces going on at the moment, and we're doing like our big overarching thing for the month is we're having a big Rainbow Road Mario Kart tournament, so you can go past the N64 Mario Kart track the fastest. And it's just using that kind of like fun and things people engage with as a method to discuss LGBTQ stories and really spread positive messages about that through the organisation.
Yeah. Positive messages and Rainbow Road, they're two things that don't go together in my mind, I'll be honest, but I know what you mean. It sounds fantastic, absolutely. I'm just thrown back to the Intergames Mario Kart tournament where, I just had to put our colleagues in their place and, beat them continuously at Mario Kart. But Adele, I don't remember if you were part of that Mario Kart tournament. I don't think you were, but why don't you speak to us about your journey into the industry? You're a lot newer in the industry, sort of 6 months. What's been your journey so far?
Yeah, sure. Also, I don't think I was part of that. I think that was maybe at a live event, I want to say.
I don't
But
know.
definitely have to do it in future.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
We'll get you in.
My journey into the industry was kind of like a conventional one, I want to say. So I studied game art at university for about 4 years. I did an undergraduate and then a master's degree. And then after that, I kind of found like my way into the industry through writing rather than art, because that was like another passion of mine. So I got through on the Kickstart scheme. And to kind of relate it back to like my sexuality and stuff like that, I think I'm quite similar to Susie in that I was a bit of a late bloomer. And I don't know if it is a late bloomer, me saying this, but around like 15 or 16 was when I actually realised like the vast majority of like labels that were out there and like how my identity related to those. So my identity I kind of like found out about stuff through watching streamers on Twitch, and one of the streamers I used to watch, he identified as pansexual, and through him I learned about like what that entailed, and I was like, oh, well, that's me. So I think that's quite funny how representation not only in games but in content creators can kind of like, I don't know, shape who we are. And in my work I try to be as inclusive as I can and kind of use my platform to make sure I cater to a wider audience and make sure people know that they have a place in the industry.
Yeah, I think your thread on Twitter recently around LGBTQIA plus was absolutely phenomenal. The research that went into that as well was fantastic. So if people haven't seen that, get onto the Intergames Twitter and have a look at the content that Adele created around that, because that was just brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I really enjoyed creating that because I got to kind of give back to the Intergames community that I kind of got a job through, and promote the people inside that were like seeking work, and that was really fun.
Wicked, awesome. Last but not least, we have Ellis. Ellis, how would you describe your sort of journey into the industry, and how far did your identity play a part in that? Did it play a part in that? A little bit chicken and egg, I suppose. Were you drawn to the industry because of the inclusivity of it, or did you sort of find your identity through that, like Adele was saying, I suppose?
I mean, hilariously, also a BioWare game awakening for me is that I played Dragon Age probably when I was a little bit too young for it, but just like the concept of being able to romance other people and basically like make a character who is whoever you want and all that kind of stuff was really cool. And it's the first game that made me kind of like realize that making games was a thing you could do, because before that it was like games existed, but at that point I was like, oh, somebody must have made this and that's a thing that I can do. I came out as bi when I was maybe like 13 or 14 and as non-binary when I was about 16. And I feel like I've been incredibly lucky to have a family who are incredibly supportive of me and who are like not ashamed of me at all. They've welcomed me entirely with open arms. When I came out, I was crying, so my little sister got pictures of puppies up on her phone to make me stop crying, which was adorable. But so I've always very much been somebody who's had the privilege to be who they are very loudly. And I think doing that in games and going into games and realizing that games was something I could do is like, I've always felt kind of, I get to do what I want and I shouldn't be ashamed of that. And doing games and being like, oh, this is, because, you know, even though it's grown a lot since then, we still have a lot of people who are like, oh, it's just games, they're so silly, they're kids things, but they mean a lot more than that to a lot of people. And I think being queer and making games are very entwined in that for me. It's like some people might not care about it, they might think it's silly, they might not understand, but it's me. So I ended up going to uni to study game design at Brunel. And all of my lecturers there were so lovely, like so incredibly lovely and really, really opening, really, really open for LGBT people. And I just got to be myself even more, and make the games that I want to make. And from there, I started getting into like more indie games, because I find that a lot of AAA games end up not having quite the representation that I want, whereas indie games, it's like made by people who are trying to make their own representation, and I think that's really cool. And then from there, I started applying to pretty much everything ever, about any job I thought I had the skills for. And I ended up at Endreams because Endreams are super, super good about like apprenticeships and Kickstart programs and graduate jobs and that kind of stuff. And Endreams have also just been incredibly lovely to work for because they seem like they really, really care about their employees and who's here. And like, for example, recently, I was like, oh, hey, it might be cool if we got some pride pronoun pins for the office so that new starters can walk in, and if they need a pronoun pin, then they can just pick one up from the front desk instead of having to bring one and remember it themselves. And it lets everybody know that the conversation's already happening here. And they just did it immediately. They were like, yeah, that's a great idea. And then bought it like the same day. And they just showed up. So now we've got pronoun pins in the office that people can just pick up.
Fantastic.
So they really care and like listen to people. And I think I'm going to keep disrupting the heteronormative status quo as much as I possibly can, because I think it's a really good thing. There's this quote, I think, from like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is something along the lines of, every time somebody tells the truth about who they are, the world becomes a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, a lovely quote. I think it's Captain Holt to Rosa, isn't it? That's a really, really lovely one when she comes out as bi. Yeah, fantastic. Amazing. Thank you for that, Ellis. That's really, really lovely. Also, I went to Brunel. We're Brunel buddies. There we go.
Oh, hey.
Hey, Brunel buddy.
I love Brunel.
Look at us. Hey, look at us. So, Ellis touched on something there. I'm going to kind of open up now to everyone, to all of the panelists. But Ellis touched on something there that I'd love to delve into a little bit more, which is the idea of video games being very much a home for those with queer identity. And I wouldn't, even think to postulate on the reasons around that, whether it's vicarious living, the idea of avatars. I don't know, just pure representation and otherworldliness. Who knows? But I want to talk a little bit about a report that was done. It was the most recent that we could find in the research for this. But in 2020, it was reported that 21% of the people working in the games industry identify as LGBTQ+. Similarly, there are levels of representation, like, for example, 1% nationally are trans, but 3% within the games industry are trans. So I suppose I just want to touch on this idea of games as a home for those with queer identity, and why we feel that is. Is the games industry that much more welcoming a place? Is it something that is being shaped, I suppose, again, a bit of a chicken and egg thing? Is it being shaped by the queer people within it, or is it just innately an interesting place for those with queer identity to exist happily? Big question, I know, but I'm just gonna open it up, I suppose. Just unmute yourselves if you want to weigh in on that. Yeah, Duncan.
I think it has a big advantage of it being a very young industry. Like as a massive industry, it's only started really taking off in the last decade or two. So I think the top level people in the organizations tend to be on the younger side, who have much more grown up with people being able to express their identity and seeing representation in the media. And so I think they're more welcoming of those ideas because it's not because it's a young person's game. I'm not talking about some organizations that everyone will be aware of, but I think like a lot of the organizations I've interacted with, it does tend to be younger people at the top who are more open to new ideas and trying new things, rather than got a lot of old industry ideas that they were brought up with by their mentor and their mentor's mentor.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Does anyone want to sort of weigh in?
I can.
Yeah, Adele.
I had one thought just now, a singular thought, that I think quite a bit of it potentially has to do with the accessibility of a lot of software and game creation toolkits to people, so that those from like more marginalized backgrounds who potentially, not to bring up the keywords, but cis white men, like they have access to the tools they need to create games that they feel represented by, and that then can gain popularity in those like groups, and kind of skyrocket from there. One lovely example of like a game that just has like a nice community is by the same person who created Pom Has Wi-Fi, or Pom Wants Wi-Fi, something like that. It's like this little like online browser game. It's a game called Butterfly Soup, and it's like a visual novel about like these like young like lesbian girls in America, I want to say, but it's just a lovely little like story about like baseball and coming of age and that kind of stuff. Yes, Pom Gets Wi-Fi. Yeah. And that's just like a lovely little example of like a game that was created using Ren'Py, and that's like a completely free software, and you can publish it yourself. And yeah, I think that's a key factor in kind of like potentially the percentages being a bit higher in the industry, since it's like if you compare it to films, that there's probably like quite a bit of cost behind the equipment you need and that kind of stuff,
Yeah, absolutely. You've touched on something really interesting there, I suppose, Adele, which is the idea of communities as well, because there is this kind of there's two sides of this, obviously, isn't there? There's the industry itself, and then there's who is the people who engage with the industry, and they are two different things, I suppose, aren't they? The creators and the audience, and yes, the two can cross over a lot, but I don't know if I'm just speaking from personal experience here, but the industry feels a lot further along than a lot of the communities around it. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that idea of the some of the communities kind of needing to catch up with the industry's themselves, and what's really being done to ensure that. So just to give an example so that you're not shooting in the dark here, I suppose I'm thinking of games that get review bombed, for example, because they have LGBT characters or storylines and things like that. And again, I'm well aware it's not all of them, and especially indie games tend to, you know, find these really sweet communities where people are extremely supportive of each other. But if we just touch on the sort of AAA side of things, and where these big titles sometimes struggle to convince entire swarms of their community to sort of be along with the ride on LGBT stories.
Hey, I have an answer for this.
Yeah.
I guess also Adele's previous answer is really funny because I was like thinking the exact thing you said, including mentioning Butterfly Soup. So I really enjoyed that.
Yay!
To that recommendation. It's an amazing game. Very sweet. So yeah, I guess one of the things that we found at Charmix on Love and Pies is we've taken like the casual mobile audience and like we've not massively changed the demographics that we're like advertising the game towards, but we have found by and large the response to having an incredibly diverse cast and like incredibly diverse storylines and like lots of queer representation has been really positive. And like we weren't fully expecting that because I think we thought that there would be a bit more backlash. Like you mentioned, George, like some communities being kind of a bit behind maybe, like, and also some targeted sort of, I don't know what to call it apart from like trolling reviews and stuff. But we've found so far like that overwhelmingly we've had positive feedback and people being really happy that the representation is there. And then there's like a very small amount of reviews that we get that are negative about it. And it is interesting that like the numbers skew that way because we have seen as well, like in games that are still for mobile but a bit more mid-core, like the fan base seems to respond in a much more negative way to stuff like that. So I wonder if it's something about like the content of the game having to sort of be in line with the message that the company is giving out, because like sometimes in more mid-core games you might not have that kind of representation actually be a part of like the game itself. It might be like just a part of the character lineup or something like that. But if it's part of the actual gameplay, like, you know, in a game where the storyline is like very relevant, like that sort of thing, I guess then players who are engaged and are going to be engaged in the community have already kind of like self-selected to stay. So you have a more positive community around it. So I think that's definitely been like something that seems to have happened for us at least.
Yeah, I think you probably got it in one there, Alice, because the thing that I was thinking of, and I'm not going to name names, but like a popular zombie story game that was very good and very fun, and then a sequel which had again very prominent LGBT representation within the story, but it's still a zombie survival game. And so yeah, maybe the content itself is something, if it pulls itself towards certain areas of society, it's going to pull those trolls out as well, I guess. Just pivoting slightly and having a little think about another aspect of this, and again I'm just going to go back to some statistics, but in terms of this Yuki survey that was done, it cross-referenced people's sexuality with certain elements of mental health. So I just wondered if we could take a minute just to touch on sort of mental health and why representation within games perhaps is important, because it can help with areas of this mental health stuff. So specifically anxiety and depression, if people on this survey identified as straight, there were 20% who also who were also diagnosed with anxiety, 15% with depression. When you start moving down different labels, bisexual, for example, is 47% with anxiety, 41% with depression, lesbian and gay, 31% anxiety, 27% depression, and then other, which, you know, it's a very catch-all thing. Oh, here we go. Trans, for example, 55% anxiety, 55% depression. So I suppose something I just kind of want to float out to the panel is this idea that, yes, it's fantastic that we've got representation within the games industry that far outstrips, societal figures. Again, the figure I suppose I'll go to is 1% national for trans, 3% within the games industry. But along with these brilliant numbers for representation, there is also an inordinate amount of mental health issues that seem to be there as well. So I just suppose I want to touch on that and people's relationship with mental health within the industry and via their identification, I suppose. Susie, how do you feel about
that? So to a certain degree, I wonder if both the census and also the trend in general also shows a bit that we as an industry just talk more about these things. So I wonder if some sectors might not also have, like especially in tech, have similarly high numbers in these things, but in games it just feels a bit safer to talk about this because we are so we have a lot of movements internally that talk about things like diversity and mental health. So one observation I just made, I found it quite stunning to come into the company, and while it took a few years to get the discussions going, once they were going, we talked about both, LGBT rights and identities as well as mental health quite openly, and I've not experienced it in any other areas I've worked in before. Like before that, I worked more in the tech sector, and we did not speak much about either. So I don't know. I just wonder if to a certain degree we just have a bit more vulnerability there, that we disclose it more rather than that it's higher than elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I remember coming into games after having worked in TV and film, and just being absolutely astounded that, within our Slack there's a health and well-being section, and people are really open and having those discussions about, not feeling great, and people just being very supportive and listening and so on and so forth. So yeah, I hope you're right with that. I think that's a really lovely thought.
I mean, it's obviously not fully because there is a higher, context, like a relationship between being LGBTQ plus and on the spectrum and having more mental health issues for very sad and obvious reasons. But I think at least to a marginal point, I think it might influence a bit the discussions we're having and why we're having them.
Yeah, absolutely. Duncan, from an HR point of view, do those figures surprise you? Are they something that you kind of feel acutely aware of, or?
I've read the census that you're talking about, and I don't think anything on it shocked me significantly. Coming from other industries, I'd agree with what Susie said, is that there is a much more positive conversation to be had about mental health. Everyone engages and discusses with it at work. It's something that managers are all acutely aware of. It needs to be spoken about, and that there is a high rate. I think it's a high, from the census itself, it says that there's a larger proportion than the general population of LGBTQ plus people in games, and with that brings, for want of a better term, the baggage that comes from that is that most people who are LGBTQ plus have baggage that straight people don't, in terms of the trauma of coming out, and I think all of us have experienced at least a microaggression in our life towards us because of our identity, and that itself brings more trauma, and that needs to be discussed, and it influences your work and your life, and there's no way to stop that from happening. So from an HR point of view, it's making sure that's appreciated and it's understood and it's supported at work.
Fantastic. I'm just going to open up that question to the group in case there's anything anyone else wants to sort of bring in. Ellis, I see you're on.
So I think, this is kind of to the conversation that we're having more broadly, but I don't mean like what I'm about to say rejects. I don't mean it in like a bad way, because I am one of them. But like social rejects kind of tend to find each other, and I think gaming particularly is also in itself like a social reject because, as I said earlier, it's like it's not taken very seriously as a medium. And so I feel like a lot of LGBTQ people end up in gaming because we're like, oh, I can be myself here because people don't take this seriously and they don't take me seriously, and I found a bunch of other people. Like, at least that's how it is for me. And I think part of the reason that we have so many mental health issues is, like, even though gaming is to some extent more open and talks more about these kinds of things because of that stuff, it is still under the umbrellas of heteronormativity and the patriarchy and capitalism and etc., all the terrible things in the world. So we end up still having those kinds of things affecting us. But I agree in that it's like we all feel like we can talk about it more because gaming's new. We can do anything we want with it. And I feel like a lot of people are really trying to choose being kind and talking about things like mental health and talking about things like being LGBT, because even though a lot of like AAA big budget whatever games are all like we're gonna be big men with guns, indie games are so free and so lovely, and they really like try their best to just talk about things that even like wider society aren't quite ready for because we're new and because we can.
Yeah, for sure. Lovely sentiment. Yeah, fantastic. So there are just a couple of sort of quick fire questions I want to go through, and then we're going to start taking questions from the live panel chat. So chat, if you have questions for any of our panelists or something you want to put to all of our panelists, like please do get it in there, and we'll make sure that we address those in just a few minutes. One thing I want to know, and it's a bit more playful, but and a couple of people have already given their answers, but I suppose on the topic of Dragon Age Awakening, what were people's gaming awakenings? A character, it can be a franchise, it can be anything like. So I know a couple of people said BioWare, but is there a character in particular who really stands out? Dragon Age the same. Let's just go through everyone and see. I'll just do this
really cool. And not only seeing that and seeing like a character who is unapologetically himself and is willing to do whatever he needs to and leave his family and leave his country in order to be himself, but also talking to the people behind it and seeing them say stuff like, yeah, we wanted to make sure that we were telling stories that mattered to people and telling stories that like people would see themselves in and that they would find strength in, was really, really cool. And I think is still a really big influence on my own game making stuff to this day.
Amazing. I'm going to reset because that was an amazing answer, and I don't want any other panelists to feel the pressure. I like Sonic. I refuse to apologise for it. Okay, I refuse. It was an awakening.
I feel like there's a huge community around Sonic.
There is.
Yeah, the like queer identifying.
Yeah, I don't know why it is. It's look, I'm not here to shame, but it's not a furry thing. It's a Sonic thing. It's just Sonic's hot, all right. Susie, what's yours? I'm going to swiftly move on.
It's not Sonic, I can say this much. I don't know. I mean, I knew that I was bisexual before I played Skyrim, but I had this moment in Skyrim, definitely, where I remember when you wear that little amulet, NPCs start chatting you up. And I was really annoyed by all the dudes coming on, because usually they were like either really arrogant archdukes you talked with before and suddenly they're an interest with you. It's like, why would I want to date you? Or, some poor farmer's person. I remember being really put off, and then like Ayla the Huntress spoke to me and she was like, "Hi, oh, are you available?" And I was like, "Oof, I could date Ayla the Huntress." And I had this moment of like, yes, bisexual panic in the game for the first time, and I was like, I don't know, I just realized in this game, in this moment, that none of the male characters interested me, and I didn't even think about romance as part of the game or as an aspect that I was interested with. But as soon as I a character appealed to me, and I was like, oh yeah, actually that's quite interesting. So I more had this moment of like self-recognition. But I don't know, games that recently also impressed me, I just wanted to bring that in. There was a storyline with a character that was I forgot the term now. Anyway, yeah, someone else can go.
Well, no, while you think of it, I want to just jump on that, because I was thinking, if I was growing up now and I got to play Hades, my God, like,
oh yes,
that would be an awakening of awakenings. Adele, how about you?
Yeah, this is a weird question, because I can't really remember when I awoke, Like, it's just, at one point I just kind of realized it, and then I was, from then on, like I said earlier, it was because of that streamer, and I guess probably seeing him show attraction to men and women and non-binary people, and like anyone really, like, and being open about that, I think that kind of allowed me to accept it as well, and understand that it was a possibility. But yeah, to kind of backtrack to how we were talking about, like violent games and how they don't really cater to the kind of audience we're talking about. I'm going to talk about my hyperfixation of the moment, which is the Yakuza franchise. And I was playing recently, and with the Yakuza franchise, there's a lot of side quests which aren't really related to the main story, aren't really canon. But in those side quests, there are a lot of diverse characters, and one in particular in Yakuza Kiwami, which is set in like 2004, I want to say. There is a lesbian hostess who the main character Kiryu can talk to, and obviously she's working as a hostess, which is to kind of like appeal to men. But she says, as part of her like reason for being a hostess is so she can be surrounded by cute girls, and it's just lovely. And how Kiryu, who's like this Yakuza dude, a big buff man, is so very understanding of this. Like, it takes him a minute, and then he's like, oh, okay, so you're into girls, okay, cool, and we'll just go with that. And I think that's so important, especially for a game made in Japan, which addresses that same-sex marriage is was not legal in Japan at that moment. I'm not sure if it is now, but they actually address it in the story as well, saying like how two characters had to move away from Japan to get married. And I don't know, that kind of representation in a game that's all about fighting to win, I think is just very nice. That's great. Plus the kind of like drag representation of another character as well is very nice. Okay. I don't know,
that's grand. When you said plus, I really, really thought you were going to have my back and say plus Sonic. But there we go. Alice, how about you? Do you have a particular game that sort of stands out for you?
Yeah, I think so. So I already knew that I was bi when I got into games, but I think the thing that's really like cemented that and possibly made me gayer, if like I guess that's the thing, right? Is Dungeons and Dragons, because I've been playing that for like quite a few years now, and I've played lots of different characters, I've run lots of different games, and at least in terms of like player characters, I have yet to play one that isn't LGBTQ in some way. Like all of my characters are queer, most of my NPCs are queer. So I think it's definitely made me gayer in a way.
I'm with you 100% there. I don't think I've ever rolled a character who hasn't tried to seduce, at least one person that's not the same sex sim, but there we are, or her, or them. Duncan, how about you?
I want to seem young and say Dorian from Dragon Age Inquisition, but it's older than that because I'm older than that. Sorry, I was having to move a cat.
No worries.
So mine would be probably Kaiden from Mass Effect. And I was bitterly disappointed in Mass Effect 1 I couldn't romance him. But that all got corrected later on in my playthroughs. When I got to Mass Effect 2 and 3. But yeah, big shout out to Dorian in Dragon Age Inquisition. And with the new Dragon Age coming to the Winter, I'm hoping we can get revenge for him on his family. I also want to shout out like a negative side of this is Panam in Cyberpunk 2077.
Yeah.
That woman will not leave you alone. And I think that's a really important thing in game design is when you're playing, like me, my Cyberpunk character was a gay man. And I think I had to shut her down 6 or 7 times, and it actually really became quite an annoying and frustrating element of the game.
God.
And there's been long, lengthy discussions of me hating on her in private text messages with friends who are all about Panam. And I'm like, no. She won't leave me alone. I don't want to engage with the character anymore. I've said no like 5 times. I think it's a really problematic piece of Cyberpunk's design.
Yeah, I would agree.
I actually got to talk to Luke Christensen about Kaiden as well, if you're interested, Duncan, because he basically, one of my questions was, how come you decided to make Kaiden bi in the last game and not in the first 2 games or whatever? And he was like, well, decided is kind of a weird word, and a bunch of people got really mad at us for it, but it's kind of like, because they thought it was like, oh, it's retroactive, but who's to say that's not just something that he discovered about himself within those time periods and in those games, which I thought was like a really cool answer.
I was also quite happy to have an unrequited love with Kaiden. Like, if that was the way it's going to go, because, he can identify as straight if he wants to. As long as they introduce some other gay romances into the game, it would have been fine by me. But, yeah, no, I was happy that they adjusted him.
Wicked. Thank you so much, everyone. Let's have a look at some questions in the chat. I know there was one in pinned. Talking about representation, what do you think big AAA games still lack? A vague question for everyone. From Hatana.g. So what do we think?
I would say with games that include romances, the option, kind of like how we've discussed a bit, the option to romance like everyone who is available. I feel like that's just like quite an easy way to boost the inclusivity of stuff. Like a good example of one game that kind of does that is Sims, in like its most basic form, where from the get-go it didn't really matter like what genders your characters were. They could still, like get together. So I think definitely more games should kind of cater to that and just allow it as an option, because it's like, I don't know, to me it feels like an easy fix.
Yeah, absolutely. Duncan?
I think one of my favourite games, and I've been playing on and off the last half decade, is Overwatch. And I think they've got some fantastic pieces of representation in there, but they hide it so much because of the trolls. So they've got a character who's autistic, and you can see through some of her lines and dialogue in the game that she's autistic, but they then hide it in a comic that's buried online because they're so concerned about the impact it will have on their monthly active users, their daily active users. So I think like there's the big thing for AAA games is they have to hide it from the audience, because at the end of the day, they've got to be able to pay them to make the game. And I think that's where indie games kind of steal it from the AAA platform, is that because the cost of making the game is so much lower, they can kind of get away with many, many more things. And I think games like Unpacking, which are fairly unashamedly LGBTQ+, showing that actually you can be really popular and have that in it, and it doesn't have to result in a total shitstorm, I think is really positive.
Yeah, for sure. I'd agree with that 100%. It's an interesting problem as well, isn't it, that they put themselves in, because it's not like hiding it in a comic is going to stop certain people from finding it who would have a problem with it anyway, but it does mean that some people who are perhaps slightly more casual, but to whom that representation would matter more, they don't get to see the actual representation that they're vaguely putting in there. It's a strange one.
Yeah, especially as one of the most prominent characters, like two of their most prominent characters in Tracer and Soldier 76 are both gay, and there's no comment on it at all in the game.
Yeah, it's a bizarre one. We've got some more comments here. Please, more ASD representation. Yeah, absolutely. As an autistic man myself, do feel that. Do we have any other questions in the chat? We've got 5 minutes left, and if you're not going to put questions, I'm just going to talk about Sonic. To be honest, guys.
I mean, I have an answer to the last one, if that's
Yeah, go on, Ellis.
I think a lot of games could work on character creators, because I know like a lot of big AAA games do, and just general like letting the player choose stuff. Like I don't know if anybody's seen or played it, but Tiny Tina's Wonderland, I got to play the demo, and it let you have they them pronouns, and none of the options were gender locked. So you could literally just like make whoever you wanted, and I think that's really cool. It still had the kind of like body type thing where one of them was traditional manly man and one of them was like smaller and had a chest. But it's like a good start, and I think as well just character creators generally and making sure that they can represent everyone and not just the majority, because they have historically, for example, a really bad job with also having black hairstyles or being able to recreate like Eastern Asian facial features or any of that kind of stuff, and even like in games letting people be romanced but asexual and all that kind of stuff. I think just generally games could do a little better at trying to represent more people.
Yeah, for sure. And Tiny Tina's Wonderland is again maybe one of those that's borrowing from D&D, which has that freedom, doesn't it, to do those things as well. But yeah, you're right. It would be fantastic if we could get. And Molly said this as well in the chat. Different body shapes, disabilities, prosthetics. You know, there's definitely room for those sort of body types to be represented as well. We've only got a few minutes left, but there is a question here. With the large walkouts that many large studios have had over the last few years, what do you think those studios could do to rebuild trust with their current/future employees and fans?
I think that's quite difficult to answer when we talk about walkouts in studios, because there's obviously a huge difference between US and UK. I think, like, if we're talking about Raven over in the US, a massive step forward was made forward with Activision announcing they're recognizing the union. I think that's kind of like Microsoft are making some big steps and improvement in that as well, with them now saying that across the organization they're going to be publishing salary figures. They're going to remove protected covenants from contracts, and what that means is removing the clauses in contracts that state you cannot go and work for a competitor for X period of time. I think it's really important, especially stateside with their more relaxed employment law, that those sorts of moves and strives are made to not discourage people from applying. Because if you look at the data on like publishing salary info, that's something that historically, if you allow negotiation in salaries, that tends to favour straight white men over anybody else. So with Microsoft pushing that out, it's hopefully going to force other companies to follow suit. And I think it's waiting for those big dogs to make those changes that forces everyone else to behave, especially in like big corporate America.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else want to just jump in on that before we wrap up? Yeah, Susie?
I think in general, it's just very important to have like senior leadership buy-in in any company. That's from my experience, that's the big changing factor. If you have the senior management willing to participate in discussions around be it LGBT and other diversity issues, and whether they make it a thing that they regularly talk about to foster that kind of culture within a company or not. That can make or break, I think, how the trust is there and built.
100% agree with that. Okay, I think that's probably the perfect note to leave it on. Thank you so much to my panel, Ellis, Susie, Adele, Alice, and Duncan. Thank you ever so much, everyone who's stayed and listened and provided questions. Really, really enjoyed having this conversation. It's an important conversation. So if you want to keep the chat going, please feel free in the panel chat. And I don't know, what do you say to wrap these things up? Keep watching the skies? I don't know. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for hosting us, George.
Hey.
Thank you, George.
Yeah,
And
thank
to
you.
and to Jaden for helping set it up as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You've
Thanks,
both been
Jake.
amazing.
Cheers, guys. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Bye.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.